Big 4 Ice Caves Incident. On 31st July 2010, the Tam family set out for a perfect day in the wilderness. They were visiting the Big 4 Ice Caves in Snohomish County, Washington. Grace Tam was an 11-year-old girl with a sweet nature and bright intelligence. She walked eagerly with her parents up the 1-mile hiking trail. The Big 4 Ice Caves were one of Washington State's most popular destinations. Thousands of families visited each year to see the spectacular ice formations. When they arrived, the massive walls of blue-white ice were breathtaking. Large yellow warning signs were posted everywhere. The signs clearly stated that visitors should not enter the ice caves. The ice formations were incredibly dangerous and constantly shifting. The Tam family was responsible and heeded the warnings. They settled on a rock formation about 15 feet from the cave entrance. This seemed like a safe distance. Grace sat contentedly between her parents, enjoying their picnic lunch. Her eyes were wide with wonder at the frozen spectacle. What they didn't know was that danger lurked above them. High above the cave entrance, an enormous chunk of ice was ready to fall. It was roughly the size of a pickup truck and weighed several tons. Without any warning sound, the massive ice formation suddenly broke free. It plummeted directly toward where Grace sat with her parents. Grace had no time to react or escape. The sound of impact was tremendous. Grace disappeared beneath tons of falling ice. Her parents were sitting just inches away. Complete strangers visiting the caves immediately rushed to help. They began performing CPR on Grace desperately. Some visitors ran back down the trail for help. Cell phone service didn't work at the caves. They had to drive 7 more miles to call emergency services. Professional rescue workers had to carry equipment up the mile-long hiking trail. 2 hours and 20 minutes passed before rescuers arrived. Despite everyone's heroic efforts, it was too late. Grace Tam succumbed to her crushing pelvic injuries. Her small body could not withstand the tons of ice that fell on her. The 11-year-old girl who began the day with excitement was gone. Howe Caverns Incident. On the 24th of April 1930, a massive explosion shook the hills of New York. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Workers at the North American Cement Company quarry detonated 7.5 tons of dynamite. The blast was so powerful it could be heard for miles. Shockwaves spread through the bedrock, creating hairline cracks in the limestone. These cracks reached down toward Howe Caverns below. The quarry workers had no idea what they had unleashed. Poisonous gases trapped in the rock for thousands of years began seeping through the cracks. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide flowed into the cave system. Owen Wallace, a 27-year-old chief electrician, arrived at Howe Caverns for work. John Sagendorf, a 45-year-old company secretary, came with him. The two men entered the elevator and descended into the cave. They had no idea deadly gases were filling the passages below. Wallace and Sagendorf began a routine maintenance work near the Belle of Moscow formation. Wallace worked on electrical connections while Sagendorf checked safety barriers. Neither man noticed the invisible poison building around them. The first symptoms were barely noticeable, slight shortness of breath and mild dizziness. But the gases were attacking their bodies. Their vision blurred and coordination failed. Both men collapsed in the depths of the cavern. The invisible poison had taken their lives. On the surface, a 25-year-old cave guide grew worried. The two men should have returned by now. He decided to go down and look for them. The guide discovered their collapsed bodies near the Belle of Moscow formation. Then he realized something terrifying. He was experiencing the same symptoms: dizziness, difficult breathing, and growing weakness. He abandoned any hope of helping them and ran for his life. Fighting the poison, he stumbled toward the elevator. Each step was a battle to stay conscious. He collapsed the moment he reached the surface. People rushed him to a hospital in Albany. He barely survived the gas poisoning. Rescue teams with oxygen equipment retrieved Wallace and Sagendorf's bodies later that morning. Medical examination confirmed both men died from poisonous gases caused by the quarry blast. 10-Mile Pit Incident. On the 20th of March 2002, two young friends decided to explore a cave. Joel Brooks was 24 years old and Josh Almond was 23. They were in Knoxville, Tennessee at a cave called 10-Mile Pit. The cave was located right next to a suburban golf course. A few days earlier, they had discovered the cave entrance with the gate open. On Wednesday evening, they decided to explore deeper, but they made a critical mistake. They brought only a rope and a flashlight, no helmets, no harnesses, no proper safety equipment. 10-Mile Pit had a 75-foot deep entrance with 4 dangerous sections: a 15-foot free drop, a 40-foot mud slope, a 10-foot climb, and a final 20-foot drop to a stream. The two men began their descent into the darkness. They successfully navigated the first 3 sections. Josh Almond was near the top of the final 20-foot drop when disaster struck. He suddenly lost his grip on the rock. In a fraction of a second, he lost control completely. Almond tumbled down the slope, bouncing against rock and mud. He went over the final drop and fell through the air. He landed hard beside the stream at the bottom. The impact was brutal. Brooks called down to his friend from above. Almond responded but was badly injured. He had hurt his shoulder and head and couldn't climb back up. Brooks climbed down to try and help, but Almond's injuries were too severe for him to climb. Brooks made the difficult choice to leave and get help. He climbed back up the 75-foot pit alone. When he emerged, he ran across the golf course fairway. Golfers watched in surprise as the mud-covered man sprinted past. Brooks reached a house and called emergency services. The Knox County Cave Rescue Team was dispatched. Professional rescuers descended with expert equipment. They placed Almond on a backboard and secured him in a rescue litter. The team used mechanical systems to haul him up slowly. The entire operation took about 2 hours. Finally, they brought Almond to the surface alive. He was rushed to the hospital with head and shoulder injuries and broken fingers. Remarkably, Josh Almond survived. Illinois Cave Incident. On December 3, 2011, 4 experienced cavers entered a remote Illinois cave for a challenging expedition. Chad McCain, Todd McCartney, Ralph Sawyer, and Jason Kern planned to explore water-filled passages with dangerously low airspace. McCartney was 44 years old and the veteran who had explored these passages before. McCain was the newcomer to this specific cave system. McCartney wore a neoprene hoodie over his wetsuit for extra cold water protection. The 4 men worked their way toward the water-filled passage in the cave. When they reached their target, they saw dark, cold water with barely any airspace above. McCain volunteered to lead upstream despite being new to this cave. The water was 3 to 4 feet deep, but the low ceiling forced him to crawl awkwardly. He held his helmet in his hand and pressed his face against the rocky ceiling. The airspace dropped to 6 inches, then to only 3 inches above the water surface. McCain hesitated at this dangerous section with essentially zero margin for error. McCartney saw McCain's hesitation and made a fatal decision to take the lead. He moved past McCain and continued upstream into unexplored territory. McCartney pressed his nose against the ceiling, breathing through minimal airspace. The sensation was claustrophobic and terrifying, like swimming through a water-filled tunnel. McCartney continued for 40 feet beyond where McCain had stopped. As McCartney rounded a bend, the nightmare scenario unfolded before him. The passage angled sharply downward with the ceiling dropping even lower. In the bend, there was virtually no airspace left above the water. McCartney found himself facing a water-filled tube with no room for his head. He tried to back up, but the tight space made it nearly impossible to reverse. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped with no air pocket. The others heard sounds of distress from around the bend. McCartney began kicking and thrashing in the water desperately. McCain called out but got no response from his friend. When McCain reached him, McCartney went underwater and didn't come back up. He finally surfaced floating face down, completely motionless. McCain and Sawyer rushed forward, but the confined space made rescue difficult. McCain finally reached McCartney after about 45 seconds that felt like hours. He grabbed the unconscious man and dragged him downstream towards safety. McCain found a section with more airspace to begin emergency treatment. McCartney's eyes were glassy and showed no signs of consciousness. McCain immediately began CPR in the cramped cave conditions. Sawyer and Kern helped keep McCartney's head out of water during rescue breaths. After 2 to 3 minutes, McCartney suddenly regained consciousness. The relief was overwhelming, but they knew they weren't safe yet. They moved him to a mud bank where he could sit up and recover. The journey out was a nightmare of endurance and determination. They had to navigate a 300-foot crawl with only 6 inches of airspace. McCain created a flotation device using waterproof packs tied to his waist. McCartney could rest his head on the packs while McCain pulled him through. Hour after hour, they worked their way through the cave system obstacles. Finally, 6 hours after entering, all 4 men emerged from the cave. McCartney was taken to the hospital where he spent 4 days recovering. Doctors confirmed he had nearly drowned, and his friend's quick action saved his life. Cenote, Chac Mool Cave Incident. On April 19, 2012, 3 divers entered Cenote, Chac Mool in Mexico late in the afternoon. Carlos was a 28-year-old diving guide who had worked at the Cenote for 2 years. He had performed hundreds of cavern dives in the safe zone where natural light could reach. But Carlos had a dangerous secret. He wasn't certified to lead cave diving trips. That afternoon, Carlos met Marina and Eduardo, a young Brazilian couple on their honeymoon. The newlyweds had saved for months to afford this trip to Mexico. They arrived just 1 hour before the Cenote closed for the day. As they prepared their equipment, Carlos made a deadly decision. He had noticed stunning rock formations deeper in the dangerous cave zone. The 3 divers entered the water as staff began closing procedures. Carlos led Marina and Eduardo through the initial underwater passages. The water was perfectly clear with schools of fish swimming between rock formations. Marina swam close to Eduardo, amazed by the underwater cathedral-like atmosphere. As they swam deeper, Carlos began leading them away from the safe cavern zone. The natural light from the surface grew dimmer, but the couple trusted their guide. They had no way of knowing they were entering an area requiring advanced certification. The overhead openings to the surface became fewer until they disappeared entirely. They were now in the dark zone where only experienced cave divers should venture. About 80 meters from the surface, Carlos began to realize his mistake. The passage ahead split into multiple tunnels, and he wasn't sure which way led back. Marina was the first to show signs of distress in the overhead environment. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming her air supply much faster. Eduardo noticed his wife's distress and tried to signal to Carlos. As Marina's air supply dwindled, panic began to set in completely. She tried to swim upward but found only solid rock overhead. The realization that she was trapped underground overwhelmed her completely. Eduardo made the fatal decision to share his air with his panicking wife. In the stress and confusion of the cave, this became nearly impossible to execute safely. Both newlyweds were now consuming Eduardo's air supply at a dangerous rate. Carlos finally realized the severity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina had already inhaled water as her air supply ran out completely. Eduardo tried desperately to save his wife, but had exhausted his own air. In the darkness with no natural light, all three divers became disoriented. Above the surface, the Cenote had officially closed for the day. Staff noticed Carlos and his clients hadn't returned, but weren't immediately concerned. As evening wore on with no sign of the divers, concern grew into alarm. Emergency services were notified and a search and rescue operation began. Cave diving rescue teams were called in with powerful lights and specialized equipment. Shortly before 2 a.m. on April 20th, the search teams made the tragic discovery. The three bodies were found deep in the cave zone, far beyond the safe area. Bayano Cave Incident. On November 21st, 2021, 16 people entered a cave near Lake Bayano in Panama. The group included 11 locals from Panama, 1 Canadian tourist, and 4 friends from Venezuela. Their guide had been leading cave tours for over 10 years and knew the caves perfectly. The group put on their headlamps and entered the cave entrance for what seemed like a routine tour. Everything started perfectly as the guide pointed out incredible rock formations. But while they were underground, dangerous weather was developing above them. Heavy storm clouds were rolling in fast, carrying massive amounts of water. When it rains hard above ground, all that water flows down into the cave system. The group had been underground for about an hour when their guide suddenly stopped. He tilted his head like he was listening to something that made his blood run cold. The gentle dripping sound always present in caves was getting much louder. The guide shouted instructions for everyone to move to higher ground immediately. Everyone could hear a distant rumbling sound coming from deeper in the cave. The cave was flooding and they were directly in the path of the rushing water. Above ground, the storm was pounding the jungle with devastating force. The guide started yelling instructions to follow him toward higher chambers, but water was pouring in everywhere, transforming the cave before their eyes. The limestone floors that had been easy to walk on were now slick as ice. The water was rising fast and the current was getting stronger every second. The guide was checking on each member, making sure nobody got left behind. He reached back to help one of the Venezuelan tourists navigate a treacherous section, but the cave floor was so slippery from all the rushing water. In that split second, his foot slipped and he fell hard. His headlamp went flying and smashed against the cave wall. The current grabbed him immediately and swept him toward the darkness. The group tried to save him by forming a human chain. Their guide managed to grab onto a rock in the rushing water. For a brief moment, it looked like they might pull him to safety, but the rock was wet and the current was relentless. His grip slipped, and in that instant, he was gone. Even as the water carried him away, he shouted instructions to save the group. 15 people were now trapped in a flooding cave with no guide and limited light. Above ground, a local man who had waved at them grew worried and contacted emergency services. Back inside the cave, the water kept rising with a deafening roar. The Canadian tourist used his camera flash to help light their surroundings. The water was now waist deep and strong enough to knock people down. As they fought through flooding passages, 2 more people were claimed by the water. A middle-aged Panamanian man lost his footing in the vicious current. A young Venezuelan woman was also swept away as people tried to help. In minutes, they went from 16 excited tourists to 13 terrified survivors. The remaining 13 somehow managed to keep going through the nightmare. They climbed over rocks and pulled each other through flooded passages. Their headlamp batteries were dying, adding another layer of terror. They spent hours in freezing water in almost complete darkness. Eventually, the 13 survivors found their way to a higher chamber. They were exhausted, freezing, and traumatized beyond belief. When rescue teams finally reached them, they had been through hell. All 13 survivors emerged from the cave alive, but forever changed. The guide's body was recovered the next day, along with the 2 other victims.